our final paper, Walden BELLO will come up and summarize everything. Very good, Walden.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to ISA and Michael for inviting me to participate in this presidential plenary. Well, in much of the developing world, these are non-revolutionary times. Despite setbacks in terms of delivering on their promise of bringing about prosperity, neoliberal policies continue to reign supreme in policy making, if only as default strategies that technocrats and elites can resort to in the absence of a credible alternative paradigm for economic transformation. Poverty and inequality are rife, but progressive movements remain marginalized in most countries. Whether reformist or revolutionary, these forces have failed to attain the critical mass that would propel them to hegemony in the political arena. Though, of course, there are exceptions. In most countries, progressive parties active in the parliamentary arena have the choice of either remaining in permanent opposition or seeking alliances with liberal or traditional parties. Those choosing the latter option find that they need to place plans for comprehensive reform or strategic transformation on the back burner and settle for piecemeal reform, choosing carefully the issues for which they will stake their efforts in securing in the short and medium term. In the Philippines, for instance, my party, Akbayan, or Citizens Action Party, of which I am one of the members sitting in parliament, is part of a mildly reformist coalition led by a traditional party. In his political order in changing societies, Samuel P. Huntington asserted that reform is harder than revolution. After several years of serving as an elected official, I think that this is probably the only point on which I can agree with this neoconservative icon. Having said this, I would nevertheless like to say that there are opportunities or spaces for achieving progressive reform. One of these openings is the issue of corruption. All sectors of society are bothered by the corruption of government officials and corrupt ties between government and business, often known as crony capitalism. An alliance between civil society and reformist groups in government can be a potent force in dealing with corruption. This alliance can produce positive results. For instance, in the Philippines, it played a central role in the historic abolition of the pork barrel or unprogrammed government funds given by the executive to members of the legislative branch, one of the legacies that we got from the US government. Many countries can boast of such achievements in anti-corruption efforts. Probably even more exemplary than the Philippines in fighting corruption is Indonesia, where prosecutions of corrupt officials by the Corruption Eradication Commission have achieved a 100% conviction rate, sending even high-profile politicians to jail for their misdeeds. As one account notes, the Commission has enjoyed widespread popular support on account of its, quote, ability to prosecute those at the top of the food chain, unquote, which had insulated it against reprisals from resentful elites. Reducing corruption undoubtedly contributes to reducing inequality, both directly and indirectly. Nevertheless, campaigning against corruption is not usually high up on the agenda of progressive groups. The hesitation many progressives have with the corruption issue is that it is a double-edged sword. Multilateral agencies like the World Bank and Asian Development Bank have promoted the view that, quote, good governance, unquote, is a central problem in development, by which they mean that much corruption is brought about by government intervention in the economy, which creates opportunities for corruption. In other words, anti-corruption discourse is tied by this institution to an ideologically motivated neoliberal agenda. Elites jockeying against one another for political office have jumped on the anti-corruption bandwagon, and a key part of the reason is that it is a discourse that allows them to paint themselves as saints and their foes as devils, while marginalizing the urgency for structural change like agrarian reform and income distribution. For progressives, the greatest risk involved in the anti-corruption discourse is the way it can be manipulated by threatened elites to derail efforts at progressive transformation. The most recent case of this is Thailand, where the conservative royalist elites were able to mobilize the Bangkok middle class on an anti-corruption platform to create a political paralysis that provoked the military to launch a coup d'etat. The object of the coup, just like last May 22, was the populist government associated with the exiled Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. An earlier putsch in 2006 overthrew Thaksin, who is enormously popular with the rural lower classes. There is no doubt that Thaksin bought many of his political alliances with elite politicians. But the main reason he was able to carve out such massive popularity among the rural and urban poor of Thailand was because he ended the enormously harmful policy straitjacket that the International Monetary Fund imposed on Thailand following the Asian financial crisis of 1997, and promoted programs that directly addressed the needs of the marginalized sectors. The Thai political and intellectual elites, resorting to corruption discourse, were able to define these programs as other forms of vote buying. The real issue, however, was the empowerment of the poor that Thaksin's program brought about, which led to creation of a massive electoral majority, which, in the eyes of the elite and the middle class, threatened a fundamental and permanent distribution of political and economic power. With this perspective, it is not surprising that the struggle against corruption was turned into a struggle against democracy, because the ballot allegedly enabled ignorant voters who did not know their real interests to bring corrupt politicians to power. The slogan, "Reform Before Election," that mobilized the academics, professionals, white-collar workers, and small business people was essentially a call to devise constitutional arrangements that would keep electoral majorities based on the rural and urban poor from forming governments. The military junta is now in the process of attempting to forge these constitutional mechanisms that would ensure continued rule by the royalist elite in alliance with the Bangkok middle classes. So the lessons for progressive is take on corruption, but don't be trapped by neoliberal and elitist anti-corruption discourses that undercut efforts at promoting an activist government role in development and transformative efforts to empower the poor and the marginalized. Beyond the corruption issue, there are other opportunities for alliances that can achieve a critical mass to push through a progressive program. In some countries where traditional institutions control the cultural discourse, reproductive health is one such opportunity. Let me again take up the case of the Philippines. The struggle for a government-supported family planning program to address both the issue of poverty and women's reproductive health has been one of the central advocacies of the progressive movement since the late 1990s. The biggest bloc has been the powerful Roman Catholic Church. The pro-reproductive health, or pro-RH movement, circumvented this bloc in two ways. First, they built a multi-class alliance for family planning, reaching out not only to the poor and middle class, but to the elite as well. Undoubtedly, many in the elite that swung around to the family planning side did so out of enlightened self-interest, meaning they saw a reduced birth rate among the lower classes as a way to ease popular pressures for redistribution. However, a not insignificant number, especially from the ranks of the upper class and middle class women, were won over by the argument that control over childbearing and family size would lead to greater women's control over their lives. The second weapon deployed by the movement to circumvent the church's opposition was to change the discourse. In the beginning of the parliamentary struggle over reproductive health, the pro-family planning forces deployed the population control argument, citing the Philippines' unsustainable 2.5% annual population growth. Against this, the bishops deployed the argument that artificial contraception was immoral because the only purpose of sex was to have children. This had, however, limited appeal, so they enlisted another argument, this one from the extreme left, that family planning was a tool promoted by the United States, specifically Henry Kissinger, to keep third-world populations down. Thus, we had the incongruous spectacle of upper-class religious conservatives parading as anti-imperialists on the floor of the House of Representatives. For a couple of years, armed with this bastard ideological formula of anti-imperialism and anti-contraception, the alliance between the bishops, religious conservatives in the House, and the president blocked the movement, any movement on the legislative front, even as the rest of the country moved forward. Several factors, including the election of a president actively in support of the bill, broke the political stalemate. But what was the decisive factor was the women's movement, which in the early 2000s reframed the issue as one of reproductive rights and health. Women had the right to space their children and determine how many children they had. Women had the right to protect their family's quality of life by limiting their offspring. Women had the right to family planning to preserve their health. It was a winning argument, one that was deployed with skill, not only at the rational level, but symbolically through the strategic dissemination of the image of an all-male hierarchy and a predominantly male Congress controlling women's choices. By 2012, some 14 years after the RH bill was first introduced, the hierarchy and its allies in Congress were bereft of viable arguments and forced into pushing two related arguments that came across to the general public as outrageous or silly. First, that condoms and other contraceptives were abortifacients. I don't know what that means. And there was no conceptual or real difference between contraception and abortion. The church defeat was sealed, though the bishops chose to go down fighting during the congressional debates in 2012 and 2013. It was a spectacular end to a long cultural war. The third example of opportunities provided by the positive conjunction of circumstances related to legislation relates to domestic or household service workers. Let me just summarize this very briefly. My point here is that for so many years, 16 years in fact, the drive or the move to give normal labor rights to domestic workers languished in the House. But in 2011, the International Labor Organization passed the Convention on Domestic Work. And this was an external factor that progressives in the Philippines, in the Senate, in the House, were able to use in order to be able to finally make domestic workers a regular part of the workforce with a law that recognized that. In January 2013, 16 years after it was first introduced, a bill recognizing the rights of domestic workers became law. Would the law have come into being without the pressure exerted by our government signing the ILO Convention on Domestic Work, owing to our government's desire to protect our household service workers in foreign households? I doubt it. The domestic workers' law is an example of how progressives can use external developments as a sword to cut the Gordian knot, tying up progressive legislation. Let me now move to legislative initiatives that bear directly on class issues. The possibilities and constraints of pushing issues that cut deeply into class interests are illustrated by the agrarian reform issue, one of the priorities of our party. Asia has been the site of 4 major successes in agrarian reform. China experienced revolutionary land reform during the 50s and 60s. In Japan, the Allied occupation government under Douglas MacArthur used land reform to destroy the landed elite that had served as a social base of militarism. South Korea and Taiwan saw reform from above, carried out as a policy to preempt peasant insurgency. In contrast, despite the fact that land reform efforts extend back to the early 1960s, land redistribution in the Philippines has been extremely slow, and the program has been condemned as a failure by critics on both the left and the right. Now, the Marcos dictatorship had a land reform program in the early 70s, but this was put on hold owing to landlord resistance. With the overthrow of the regime in 1986, a new ambitious effort was launched under the administration of President Corazon Aquino, the mother of the current president, to redistribute some 10.3 million hectares of tenanted land. The period was a time of great ferment and undoubtedly a great impetus to the passage of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program in 1988 was the rural insurgency led by the New People's Army. The law passed, but with many loopholes attached by a landlord-dominated Congress that practically limited land redistribution to public land, and left much private land untouched for the next 2 decades. With CARP in the doldrums, CARP being the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, progressive and liberal elements in Congress were able to pass a new law, CARPER, extending agrarian reform and providing it with sufficient funds for land acquisition and support services and plugging many of the loopholes of the 1988 legislation. My party was the principal sponsor of the CARPER bill, which in fact passed. And, yet one of the lessons of the agrarian reform campaign in the Philippines is that even if a unique conjuncture of events makes it possible to pass a strong law, which CARPER was, absence of political will can prevent reform. In the last 6 years, this is exactly what happened. Presidential neglect and the lack of courage to confront the landlords on the part of the minister in charge of the reform resulted in over 770,000 hectares remaining undistributed by the end of the period of land reform last month, on June 30, 2014. Half of these undistributed lands are private lands that constitute the best lands in the country. This is where we are at this point. Agrarian reform has practically ground to a halt despite the existence of a powerful law to implement it, having been stymied by landlord resistance, presidential neglect, and bureaucratic timidity. Let me then try to bring together the key points of this talk. The struggle for equality in most developing countries takes place today in distinctly non-revolutionary situations where neoliberal policies and ideology continue to reign. There are, however, opportunities or spaces for the left to push a progressive social agenda via parliamentary processes, even as part of governing coalitions. The first issue I took up as providing an opportunity for successful progressive action was corruption. Corruption is a universal concern, and its elimination or mitigation can have a positive impact on reducing inequality or promoting economic development. Yet, anti-corruption as a crusade can backfire, especially when it is promoted by neoliberals to reverse state intervention in the economy or by local elites as an alternative to redistribution of power and wealth. An even more perilous outcome is when the movement against corruption is channeled to the mobilization of the middle class to oust governments that promote popular political and economic empowerment, as in Thailand. My second proposition was that cultural issues provide an arena for advancing the progressive agenda under certain circumstances. In the case of the fight for the reproductive health bill in the Philippines, for instance, the pro-RH forces were able to split the upper and middle class using the discourse of women's reproductive rights and creating the space for the passage of the law despite the fanatical opposition of the powerful Catholic Church. The third case I brought up was how an otherwise difficult situation can be unlocked by external developments if advocates jump at the opportunity. The domestic workers' law in the Philippines, which languished in the legislative doghouse for 16 years, was made possible by the coming into existence of the ILO's Convention on Domestic Work. Finally, I asserted that measures that are a direct assault on the structures of inequality are the hardest to win in a non-revolutionary political climate. The dynamic interaction of constraints and opportunities in these struggles is illustrated in the long struggle for agrarian reform in the Philippines. Despite the skill of progressive forces in taking advantage of political conjunctures and spaces to achieve a powerful legislative act during a conservative period, the structures of agrarian inequality have remained strong owing to a combination of presidential neglect, bureaucratic timidity, and of course, landlord resistance. In sum, even in distinctly conservative times, engagement in reform politics can be productive. Smart coalition tactics and controlling the discourse of reform can make up for the absence of a generalized political ferment for change. Significant victories can indeed be won, even in non-revolutionary situations, but this will be in the nature of piecemeal reforms, not comprehensive reform. And it will not take long before reform politics bumps up against the hard structures of inequality. In conclusion, let me say that I have just begun to read Piketty. But from reviews, one of his conclusions seems to be that liberal democracies have not been particularly congenial to equity and equality. The movement towards more egalitarian trends in the distribution of wealth in the middle of the 20th century in the North was not a result of normal liberal democratic politics, but a product of war, cataclysmic economic crisis, and revolutions. In Northeast Asia as well, the emergence of relatively egalitarian social and economic structures of the newly industrializing countries stem from war, revolution, and counter-revolution. So I would just like to end by posing the question, not at all rhetorical, but very real. Will reversing the current trends towards inequality again require such explosive situations? Thank you very much.